the situation of poverty. It lasted about 6 months, and it eventually just went away, like there was no will to look at poverty. Well, where does the will to look at poverty really come from but the people who are in poverty? And if they have no voice, then their voice isn't heard. Those people with the haves aren't necessarily given away to the have-nots, especially when they don't really understand and how people got there. So it is the stories that are the most important thing to tell, and that's what somebody like Amy Goodman tries to provide. She tries to bring in the multiplicity of voices. So I think that's the main thing I would say about that. Across a whole range of media, this is a concern. I did a study of the Spokesman Review a number of years ago looking at journalistic bias. The Spokesman wasn't particularly biased. It was only biased to the extent that the reporters they had were covering stories they were interested in and most familiar with. If you hire white, middle-class, college-educated reporters, those are the kind of stories they're going to look at to tell. They weren't assigned to different kinds of stories, so the absence of diversity of staff left out the kinds of stories. The Spokesman to this day, although tries to have a more diverse voice by bringing in young people to write and so on, still don't really get the stories of the community. You just have to look at the business section of the paper, and you'll see these little snapshots of people being promoted in their businesses. You rarely, or perhaps almost never, see a person of color. If you look at the wedding photos or the anniversary photos in the paper, you almost never see a person of color, and you don't see socioeconomic levels very well represented in there because they aren't sending their photos to the paper. The businesses aren't sending those photos. The basic thing is the story in the paper has a business section to talk about businesses, but there's no workers section or employers section, labor section. It's the business because it's always about making money, and that leaves out all the people whose story isn't about making money or isn't about crime and punishment. It's about a lot of other things that really matter to our human existence. There's really a lack of spirituality that happens in our media, and that spirit really hampers and hurts our human condition. So to the extent that media can start to tell these stories, start to represent multiple perspectives, multiple views, then we have more enriching environment to really build community. And I would say in my, I guess it's going on 20 years I've been in Spokane, there have been a lot of disappointment at times how difficult it is to make change in Spokane, that the control of making choices and decision lies in very few hands. Now that's not abnormal, but it's not untraditional in other communities as well, but there's just been a lack of kind of a progressive spirit. I have seen things. I have seen things that came from the World's Fair, that beautiful park we have, other kinds of things that eventually have made it to the top of the food chain and the decision making, but those are rare, and I've never been in an environment where it seems as difficult to make change. Now my guess is a lot of change happens based both on media and interpersonal relationships. It starts out with media sort of telling the stories, but then the people, the movers and shakers in that community have to talk to each other, and they have to talk to the ordinary. The ordinary's voice, which is eliminated from the discussion, is part of the problem. And so we never get the full story, and therefore change is slow or doesn't even happen. You know, there's a lot of people's stories in Spokane that never get told. I'm thinking of one person for the Amy Goodman event who is a retired school teacher here in Spokane. He's fairly elderly, and when the Amy Goodman event was being held, we needed to charge a fee because it was a fundraiser so KYRS could build a greater antenna to reach more voices. There's nobody donating money to do that. But this person was very concerned that maybe high school students wouldn't be able to attend. So he donated $100, which would cover 20 high school students being able to attend for that $5 charge. Rather than just say we should just accept them all, he said, I'll put up the money to let them come. But he's been a member on our board of the Northwest Alliance. He's not only concerned about his generation, he's, quite honestly, this person who's a dedicated community member, never wants his name to show up on anything, but cares about future generations. And he's so disturbed about the legacy we're having right now in American society. He's a World War II veteran. He's a high school, science teacher. he has his own family and children, but he kind of pays attention to native philosophy. And he's talking about, what about 4 or 5 generations out? If we don't make a change now, we're selling our kids out. And the society we're creating is a very harmful, negative society. So how can we turn that around? How can we start to tell better stories? How can we raise more healthy citizens? How can we bring the best together from the university, from our medical community, from our social agencies, from our media, from the ordinary in town, and start to bridge and make differences for raising healthy kids in a healthy community? That's the kind of story that doesn't get told, but he's only one of many people I've met since my time here, that when I'm most down and most discouraged about things, I think, oh, look at this guy. Look at this guy. Here he comes. I want to avoid him because he's going to make me do something else I wasn't thinking of doing today. But in the end, there are always great things, and he's absolutely correct that this needs to happen. And there's a lot of people doing just that work. And although I avoid him for a second or two, I'm more optimistic when I've actually engaged in the activity, because he's the kind of person who can make a difference, and there are a lot of people in Spokane who can do that. In my life, there's been lots of positive influences. Most of my ideas are not original with me. They emanate from my teachers, the books that I read, the spiritual religious people I have had the good fortune of having interaction with. Something called Catholic social teaching, which is not necessarily part of the Catholic Church. It's about how Catholics ought to be and how Catholics ought to think. Really has influenced the field of communication. So some of the big names in communication, coincidentally, were Catholics, a person like Marshall McLuhan. So when I read where their theories and philosophies are coming from about communication, I also realize there's a spiritual thread underneath that's been very important to me. So I'm always aware of that, but I also learn from everybody. I learn from ordinary people, because part of communication is listening, and when I really listen, I begin to empathize and understand things that I'm not necessarily experiencing. So it's very hard for me to list one philosopher after another, or one social critic, but I read widely and broadly, and am quite aware of that. So I think a very practical, pragmatic person who's influenced me, John Dewey. Okay, pragmatic philosopher, John Dewey, who talked about experiential learning. And as a teacher and an educator, I found nothing better to really try to make a difference in students' lives, to take them out of theory and out of books and get them actually experiencing things and then coming back around to theory. So where does that play for people who aren't studying, who aren't students? I think we have a lot of rich people in terms of life experiences. And so the question is, do we bring those people who have those kinds of experiences in the discussion? And my experience is no, but when we do, we have much better information to make choices and make decisions on. So in a sense then, somebody like that, John Dewey, is an underlying philosophical person for me. Of course, Mother Teresa of Calcutta is another person who talks about something called mindfulness and walking the narrow ridge in order to move a society forward. Mindfulness is a concept, it doesn't just mean paying attention. It means really seeing the subtleties between things and being aware and having sensitivity to navigate that narrow ridge, to move forward and to bring people with me on that. She really saw spiritual deprivation as perhaps the biggest curse of her lifetime, 20th century. In an age of richness and multiple resources, why were people feeling spiritually deprived? Because a lot of what we consume takes us away from the more natural spiritual side of who we are and what we want. And so that part of my life is also very important to me. And I think to the degree we can make that on everybody's sort of palette of why be this way or that way, kind of raises our consciousness and therefore raises our ability to care for others. We can't really care for others if we're sort of self-indulgent and looking in all the time. So this ability to do this really is influenced in a consumer culture that we live in, and the media messages we get from consumer culture tell us that our happiness is really tied to the next thing we buy, the next thing we get. And we can't buy and get these things without actually taking them away from somewhere else.